Beijing winter, 1838. Inside the Forbidden City, an almost absolute silence reigned. Snow was slowly covering the stone courtyards. The palace's red walls seemed even taller beneath the white winter sky. Only the rhythmic sound of footsteps broke the calm. An official in a dark blue silk robe walked quickly down a long corridor toward the imperial hall. In his hands he carried a scroll, not an ordinary administrative report, not a request for appointment. This was a warning. His name was Lin Zexu. By this point, he had already earned a reputation as one of the most honest officials in the empire. He did not come from a powerful aristocratic family. He had not inherited a high position. His career had begun the way thousands of other young scholars' careers began, with endless years of study. The exam that changed lives. China had a system that drew admiration from many European travelers. Any man, at least in theory, could become a high official, not because of birth, not because of wealth, but because of knowledge. To obtain a state position, one had to pass extraordinarily difficult imperial examinations. They lasted several days. Candidates were locked in small stone cells. Their only companions were a brush, ink, paper, and their own knowledge. They wrote essays on Confucian morality. They interpreted classical texts. They analyzed statecraft. A single mistake could cost years of preparation. Many people took these exams for decades in a row. Some never obtained the position they dreamed of. Lin Zexu walked this path and proved he belonged among the finest minds of his era. The official who could not be bought. During his service, Lin repeatedly encountered colleagues for whom a state position had become a means of enrichment. Bribes, privileges, family connections. This was common practice. But Lin chose a different path. In his letters and official memoranda, he kept repeating one idea. An official exists not for his own benefit, but to serve the state. This was precisely why he was increasingly sent to places where situations were spiraling out of control. Fighting floods, tax reforms, corruption investigations, and almost everywhere he left behind the reputation of a man unafraid to make unpopular decisions. Troubling reports. In the mid-1830s, reports from the southern provinces began arriving on Lin's desk with growing regularity. At first, they seemed like ordinary statistics. More cases of smuggling, a few arrests, confiscated opium. Then the numbers began climbing sharply. Thousands of crates, tens of thousands of smokers, hundreds of officials exposed for colluding with smugglers. None of this looked like a local problem anymore. It resembled an epidemic. One evening, Lin sat for a long time over the documents. On the table lay maps of the coastline, customs reports, letters from governors, reports from the military. Each told a different story, but together they formed one picture. Smuggling was growing. Silver was leaving the country. Corruption was spreading. The army was weakening. If nothing changed, the consequences could be catastrophic. Audience at court. In early 1838, Lin was summoned to the imperial court. Emperor Daoguang listened carefully to his report. He too had already been receiving troubling news. What worried him most was not the use of opium itself. It was that the country was losing silver because of it. For the state treasury, this meant a serious threat. Without silver, it became harder to pay official salaries, to maintain garrisons, to buy grain during poor harvests, to fund major state projects. The empire's financial system was beginning to falter. Daoguang asked a simple question. Can this be stopped? Lin did not hesitate. Yes, Your Majesty, but we must act immediately. Special Commissioner. In the spring of 1839, the emperor signed a decree. Lin Zexu was granted extraordinary powers. He was appointed imperial commissioner in charge of the fight against the opium trade. He had the authority to give orders to governors, to command troops, to conduct investigations, to arrest officials, to confiscate illegal goods. In effect, He became the emperor's personal representative in the south of the country. For a Chinese official, this was one of the highest forms of trust. The road south. The journey from Beijing to Canton took many weeks. The caravan traveled by road, canal, and river. Almost every day, Lin met with local officials. He listened carefully. He asked questions. He took notes. The farther south he traveled, the more stories he heard. Peasants selling their land to buy opium. Merchants losing their fortunes. Soldiers reporting for duty exhausted. Young officials spending their nights in opium dens. Some even selling official documents to pay for their addiction. Lin began to understand that the problem ran far deeper than he had imagined back in Beijing. This was no longer merely an economic crisis. It was a crisis of state discipline, morality, and trust in authority. Canton awaits. In early March 1839, Lin's boat slowly approached Canton. Rumors were already spreading along the docks. Foreign merchants exchanged anxious news. Chinese traders nervously reviewed their ledgers. Smugglers hurried to move part of their stock out. Everyone knew one thing. A man who would not take bribes was arriving in the city, who would not bargain, and who would not look away. No one yet knew that within a few months, his decisions would mark the start of a war that would forever change the history of China. The siege of the factories. Canton, March 1839. The moment the Imperial Commissioner's boat docked, the city changed. There were no celebrations, no music, no festive processions, only orders, short, clear, and to be carried out at once. Within hours, additional patrols began appearing throughout Canton. The city gates closed one after another. Armed guards were posted on the main streets. Troops took up positions near the warehouses. By evening, the city already resembled a fortress. But the main target was not the Chinese quarter of Canton. Lin ordered the district of the 13 factories to be surrounded. A small quarter where all the foreign merchants lived and worked. A city within a city. The factories had long lived by their own rhythm. By day, trade deals were struck here. Contracts were signed in the offices. Warehouses counted tea, silk, porcelain. In the evenings, British, American, and Dutch merchants gathered for dinner. They discussed prices, the weather, the next trading season. Most of them were confident that Chinese authorities would, as always, limit themselves to another round of threats. This had been the case for years. Opium was officially banned. Smuggling continued. Everyone had grown used to it. But this time, everything was different. The order the next morning, Lin Zexu issued a brief decree. All foreign merchants were to remain inside the factories. No one was permitted to leave the quarter. No boat could sail out to sea. No cargo could be moved. Food supplies were also restricted. The district was effectively under siege. British merchants were shocked. They were used to bureaucracy, to lengthy negotiations, to mutual concessions. But no one had expected the Chinese authorities to dare isolate hundreds of foreigners. A man, between two empires. Among all those trapped inside the factories, one man faced the hardest position. His name was Charles Elliot. He was Britain's chief superintendent of trade. Formally, he represented the interests of the British Crown, but his authority was very limited. He did not command an army. He had no navy at his disposal. He could not order British ships to attack, and yet he alone was responsible for the safety of every British subject in Canton. He now had to make a decision that could determine the fate of relations between two empires. Lin's letter A Chinese official arrived at the factories. In his hands, he carried an official decree. Its content was brief. All stocks of opium were to be voluntarily surrendered to the Chinese authorities, in full, without exception. If this did not happen, the traders themselves would bear the consequences. Lin did not threaten directly. He merely reminded them that they stood on the territory of the Chinese Empire, and that it was Chinese law that held authority here. Panic spread through the factories. Some merchants insisted there could be no giving in. Others proposed negotiating. Some demanded the British Navy be summoned at once. But the fleet was far away. Help could not arrive quickly. Food supplies dwindled. Tension grew with every hour. Elliot's decision. After several days of fruitless negotiations, Charles Elliot took a step many considered extraordinary. He called on the British merchants to surrender all their opium to the Chinese authorities. He also promised, in writing, that the British government would in the future consider compensating their losses. This was an extremely risky promise. Elliot had no authority to personally guarantee such payments, but he understood, if the siege continued, the situation could end in bloodshed. The merchants agreed, not because they trusted the Chinese authorities, not even because they trusted Elliot. They simply saw no other way out. The most expensive cargo in the world. Over the following days, wooden crates began to be carried out of the British warehouses. Dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. Columns of porters moved endlessly through the narrow streets. Each crate weighed roughly 60 kilograms. The lids bore the marks of the East India Company and private trading houses. Chinese officials carefully inspected every shipment. They recorded the numbers, weighed them, counted them. By the end of the operation, Lin had received more than 20,000 crates of opium, roughly 1,200 tons of the drug. By modern estimates, its market value would run into the hundreds of millions of dollars. For its time, it was one of the most valuable cargoes ever confiscated by a state. Human, a few days later, an enormous caravan arrived at Human, a narrow strait at the mouth of the Pearl River. It was here that Lin decided to publicly destroy all the confiscated opium. News spread through the province almost instantly. Thousands of people began gathering along the shore. Some came out of curiosity, others to witness the imperial authorities finally striking a blow against the smugglers. Many did not yet realize they were witnessing an event historians would later call one of the most important of the 19th century, the largest drug destruction in history. On Lin's orders, massive trenches were dug. Workers opened the wooden crates one by one. Dark brown blocks of opium fell into the pits. Quicklime was poured over them. Seawater was added. The chemical reaction turned the thick resin into a useless mass. The process lasted nearly 3 weeks, day after day, crate after crate, without pause, without exception. When it was finished, the remaining mixture was flushed out to sea. Lin Zexu was convinced he had fulfilled his duty. He had protected the empire, carried out the emperor's will, shown that Chinese law applied to everyone, even the most powerful foreign merchants. He did not yet know one thing. In London, these same events were already being interpreted very differently, not as a fight against drugs, but as the destruction of British subjects' private property. And it was this difference in perspective that would soon lead two empires into war. The letter that could not stop a war canton. London, 1839. After the last batch of opium was destroyed on the shores of Human, silence settled over the coast once again. The trenches stood empty. The workers went home. The military withdrew part of its guard. At first glance, everything seemed finished. The contraband was gone. The imperial order had been carried out. The law had won. But Lin Zexu understood one thing clearly. He had not merely confiscated a drug. He had destroyed property that had cost British merchants enormous fortunes. The only question was how London would respond. A letter across half the world. Before preparing for the worst, Lin decided to do what he believed was right. He wrote a letter to Queen Victoria. It was not an ultimatum, nor a diplomatic note. It was, rather, a moral appeal. In it, Lin posed a simple question. If selling opium to Britain's own population was forbidden, then why did British merchants consider it acceptable to sell it to the Chinese? In the letter he wrote, roughly, if this substance harms your own country, why do you send it to ours? For Lin, this was a matter of justice. He was reasoning from the Confucian idea of a ruler's moral responsibility. If a ruler knows of a wrong, he must put an end to it. Lin was convinced the British Queen simply did not know what her subjects were doing. Today, historians have no confirmation that this letter ever reached Queen Victoria's hands. Most likely, it was never officially delivered to the British government, but the document itself survived, and it became one of the most famous diplomatic texts in Chinese history. London. While Lin hoped in the power of argument, London was discussing something else entirely. News of the confiscation of more than 20,000 crates of opium quickly reached the British trading houses, in the coffee houses of the city, in the insurance companies, at the headquarters of the East India Company, on the London Stock Exchange. Everywhere the talk was the same. Who would compensate the losses? For the Chinese government, the answer was obvious. Smuggling could not be legal. Therefore, there could be no compensation. For many British politicians, the situation looked different. They did not dispute that opium caused addiction, but they insisted China had no right to confiscate British subjects' property without negotiation or compensation. The two sides viewed the same event through entirely different legal systems, and neither was prepared to yield. The House of Commons. Inside the British Parliament, heated debates began. Some members openly condemned the opium trade. They called it immoral, a disgrace to the British Empire. Others responded, the question was no longer about opium. The question was that China had insulted the British state, destroyed British property, humiliated British representatives. If this went unanswered now, tomorrow any other country would do the same. The disputes lasted for weeks. They were fierce, and the outcome was far from certain. Lord Palmerston. Among those following events closely was Britain's Foreign Secretary, Lord Palmerston. He belonged to the school of politicians who believed international trade should be protected by force when diplomacy failed. For him, the conflict with China had long since ceased to be only about opium. It was about access to one of the largest markets in the world, about the prestige of the British Empire, about free trade, as it was understood in London at the time. It was Palmerston who would become one of the leading advocates of a military response off the coast of Hong Kong. While the politicians argued, British ship captains were already receiving new orders. In the shipyards, cannons were being refitted, gunpowder stores replenished, provisions loaded. New warships began setting out for China. For now, there were few of them, but each new ship made a diplomatic resolution less and less likely. Two men, in the spring of 1839, two men stood at opposite ends of the world. Lin Zexu looked out over the calm surface of the Pearl River. He sincerely believed he had fulfilled his duty to the emperor and the people. Thousands of kilometers away, British officials pored over maps of the Chinese coastline. They too were convinced they were defending their nation's interests. Both sides believed themselves to be in the right. Both believed they were acting justly. And that was precisely why compromise had become almost impossible. The following year, ships would appear off the coast of China, unlike any the local people had ever seen. Steam engines, iron hulls, long-range guns. They would bring with them more than war. They would bring a new era, an era in which the power of nations would be measured not by population or the richness of tradition, but by industry, technology, and naval strength. For China, this would mark the beginning of what would later be called the century of humiliation. For Great Britain, one of the most controversial victories in its history. And for the world, the beginning of a new global order